out, and welcome to the recorded version of the Parenting at Mealtime and Playtime Home Visitor Training. We are recording this for those of you who attempted to take the training on June 13th, 2018. And so we're going to run through the slides as you would have seen during the presentation. A few things you'll need to know and to participate in as you work to get your 3 credit hours. So the first thing is to take the pre-training survey. That survey is available to you via email, and the link will follow in the next slide. One additional component is to participate and view today's training. So this recording in its entirety will suffice for viewing and participating in that training. And the final thing is to take the post-training survey. That will be shared with you immediately following the training. The pre-training survey is available on SurveyMonkey through our Ohio AAP surveys. You have been sent this via email and can access it through SurveyMonkey. Should you have any troubles, please do reach out to Renee Dickman at rdickman@ohioaap.org. Since this is a recorded video, you will not be able to directly ask questions through the course of this training. However, we encourage you to ask questions to our Ohio AAP and Ohio Department of Health team. If you have any questions following the training, please feel free to reach out to Renee Dickman at rdickman@ohioaap.org.
Well, hello there. This is Dr. Amy Sternstein. I'm a general pediatrician practicing pediatrics in Columbus, Ohio, and I am very pleased that you are all very committed to the welfare of our Ohio children. I'm also going to thank both the Ohio Department of Health as well as the Ohio chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics for their commitment to working on the Parenting and Mealtime program and really providing good sound-based messages to our Ohio youth. So the quick overview of this webinar is really just to talk about the pediatric or childhood obesity crisis that we're having in Ohio and what are the measures and the messaging that we all need to share with our families in efforts in prevention. So part of this presentation will go over some of the data from both the Ohio WIC program as well as the Ohio Head Start program, and we also have some national data that is a little bit more current. We're also going to be reviewing the importance of why looking at the birth to 5 years of age is such a critical window for prevention. We will cover some of the effective health messaging that we feel is going to contribute to the welfare of the children, and review how you as a home visitor or a care provider or even a healthcare provider can really, what's your role in providing these messages, and how can the Parenting and Mealtime program help you? So we'll go through the components of the program as well. So I'm going to start off talking about, and this is the overview side, so I apologize I didn't have that showing initially. We're going to start out and just talk briefly about the BMI report among the Head Start students in Ohio, and this is data from 2014. So what we found in the young children is that 61% of them had a healthy weight, but unfortunately 17% were overweight, and in the 19% obese category, which is actually broken up into 2 categories, one being obese based on 95th to 99th percentile, which was 11%, and then the more concerning group, which is the severely obese, which is greater than 99th percentile, was up at 8%. So the total obesity category, unfortunately, saw a rise up to 19% in the Head Start population, and this is data from 2014. I don't have anything more recently from Ohio specifically. We also have another bar chart looking at the demographics in Ohio, but this is data based on WIC data. And so they were looking at children between 2 and just barely less than 5 years of age. And this was also data collected in 2014. And what you'll see is that the comparison from the Head Start data, they had mentioned there was a difference between Head Start saying that it was 19% obese. This actually shows that it's 13% statewide obese, so it's a little bit lower. But what you also see is that there really isn't a huge significant racial difference, except maybe the Hispanic level was a little bit higher. So across the board, this is clearly a concern. Now, I just, wanted to share that this data, like compared to data in the 1970s and 80s, we were only seeing childhood obesity in this age group at about 5%. So obviously there's a dramatic change. And then I don't have a slide for this, but in 2016, there was a publication from the National NHANES data, and that's across the whole United States. And they compared 2013-14 data, saying that obesity was a rate at 9, and then up to 14% most recently for 2015 and 16. So they tend to cluster 2 years worth of data. So even basically what they're saying within the last 5 years, that we actually have seen an increase from 9% to 14% in childhood obesity, looking specifically at the young preschool population. So why is this so important? This next graph shows you the prevalence of the chronic diseases and conditions within the adult population. What you'll see in the blue bars is the healthy weight population, and then what you see in the red bars is the obese population. So it clearly is showing a difference between the rate of the chronic diseases based on the obese population versus healthy weight. So the conditions that we're really hoping to prevent for these pediatric patients are the same diseases that we see in adults, but we want to prevent diabetes, we want to prevent hypertension, high cholesterol, arthritis, depression, any mental health disease. And we just found that the truth is, as your weight increases, your disease risk also increases. So we've got to keep the weight down so the disease risk is lowered. This slide just breaks down the overall toll in childhood. So there's clearly short-term issues and psychosocial issues as well as medical issues. And then there's long-term concerns that are both equally important. I think we're seeing in general a lot of mental illness, depression. Little kids tend to get bullied early on in school. And they may even see some of the changes in the skin condition, which shows some darkening called acanthosis, which is related to a pre-diabetic risk. So we are seeing indications of medical issues even in young pediatric children. And not to mention that long-term, there's heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, liver disease, and even cancer and fatty liver has been seen in adults as well. So the bottom line is that the obese young child, unfortunately, is showing a similar risk factor that we see typically in adults. Obesity really affects your entire body, and this is a schematic just showing how it can affect anything from the top of your head, meaning that it's related to headaches, but also, of course, psychosocial issues, all the way down to your toes, which may be an orthopedic concern, knee pain, foot pain, ankle pain. So there's a lot of disease processes that we have found are clearly correlated with your weight. So if we can keep the weight under control, we can also keep the disease risk down. So just keep in mind that there's really a systemic impact of obesity. It's just not one piece. It's multi. So what we're going to do now is just talk about the 5 reasons why it's so important to intervene early, and that when habits are formed early in childhood, we hope they're sustained throughout their life and they'll keep kids healthy. So the first reason is that, as I just mentioned in the statistics, there's just a newly recognized pattern emerging across the United States that children are gaining at such younger ages than ever before. And we have to acknowledge that this is the trend, unfortunately. And that is why we feel like the window of opportunity is very important between birth and 5 or 6 years of age, because we're seeing weight concerns even before kindergarten. This is an example of a BMI chart. When children are going to their primary care provider in the first 2 years, the healthcare provider will do a measurement, weight per length, and that's giving you, in a sense, it's sort of not the same thing as BMI, but it's giving you a sense of how well your height and your weight are proportioned. And then when the child turns 2, we start tracking a BMI, which is also a gauge to see how your weight and your height are equally matched. This graph is showing you that these red dots represent the BMI. So for this particular boy, at age 2, his BMI, this red dot, was close between 18 and 20, so maybe it was about 19. And then when he came in for his 4-year checkup, the next red dot shows that his BMI actually dropped, and then when he returned up at age 9, his BMI had gone back up again, and it will continue to go up. The message here is that it's normal and physiologically appropriate for the BMI to drop in the preschool ages. So your lowest fat percentage, perhaps in your entire life, may be around age 4 or between age 3 and 5. So even the children or the infants that are quite large in their infancy, once they start moving and their energy expenditure goes up, typically their desire to eat goes down because they're much more interested in play, we naturally see a thinning. And we want families to understand that that is physiologically appropriate and normal. In contrast to that, I do some weight management as well as doing primary care pediatrics. And when I see young children in my weight management clinic, I see a BMI of 19 or 20 at age 2, but then they come in at age 3, and now their BMI is 22, and then they go continue to gain at an excessive rate. At age 4, their BMI is 24. And so the trajectory is going straight uphill, and I'm not seeing that physiologic drop that I would anticipate. And those are the kids that I would really like to identify super early and get them on a better trajectory. The next slide shows you 2 different bits of information. The top being a quote that's been discussed at different conferences that I've been to, and basically they're concerned that this increasing rate of obesity and unhealthy eating habits, inactivity, et cetera, may be the first generation that will be less healthy and have a shorter expectancy than their parents. I think overall Americans have an increased life expectancy, and so this would be a dramatic change. But I think what we're also seeing, independent of the life expectancy, considered to be mortality, we're actually seeing a much increased incidence of morbidity. And morbidity means that you're disease-oriented. So you may live a long time, but you're going to live with a disease. Neither one of these options are good. And that children who are overweight or obese are 5 times more likely to still be obese as adults. And that's why we want to intervene so early. It's just so important. If you are a healthy weight child, you only run a 10% chance of being overweight versus if you are overweight already or obese as a young child, your risk of still being overweight as an adult goes up to 80%. So that's a big difference between 10% and 80%. The second reason why this is so important is that a lot of research has supported the fact that obesity prevention and interventions focused on prevention in the early years can be very effective and can last for many years. So it has a lasting impact on childhood. So the idea here, and there's an example of a study, this is referred to as the ABC study, but this was a study done in the 1970s in North Carolina in an impoverished family or environment. The study participants were about 110 children in that preschool age. They broke up the children into two groups. One group was considered a control group, which they had no intervention. The second group had an intervention that included full-time preschool starting from birth to 5 years of age. It was 8 hours a day for 5 days a week. They were provided 2 healthy meals and 1 healthy snack. They had a lot of cognitive stimulation, emotional support. They had supervised play. They even had adults interacting during mealtime. And so it was a very positive, thriving, nurturing environment. The other group didn't have the daycare situation, but they did have basically what they considered just the regular care that they would be getting either at their daycare or in their home. And what was so amazing about the study is they followed these two groups of children for many decades. In fact, they followed them all the way out to their 40s. So it was several decades later. And what they found is the group that had the intervention between birth and 5 years of age actually had better health outcomes as an adult, and they also had some better academic success, and just overall, they seemed to do better. So remember that the intervention was only done during the preschool years, and it stopped once they entered kindergarten. So it shows you in this particular group, even though it was a small group, that they had sustained benefits over time based on having a really good start in life. They also didn't have specific nutrition education. They were just simply fed good, solid, nutritious food. The next study just is entitled Small Changes Make Big Results, and this was a study, and there's a graph here that there were also two different groups. These were children between 2 and 7 years of age, and this study looked at how do we lower the screen time in children, and if we do lower the screen time, does it also affect their BMI? So this graph has 2 lines. The group on the top line, which is the dark black line, was the control group. The open circles was the intervention group. And what this study did is they went into homes, they measured their baseline use of electronics. They actually were able to lock the mechanism, and the parents were told that we would like to decrease the amount of time that your children are using these electronics to about 50% lower than what they were doing when the study was first started. And the reason why there's a disparity in these two groups is there was one group who, well, first of all, both groups, as you dropped the screen time, your BMI also dropped. And this study was followed in, it was a 2-year duration. So that was a pretty significant change over time. The other thing to notice on this graph is that there is a difference in that the group at the top with the dark circles, they were the ones that didn't have any control. The children had no control over the change in the timing of the reduction in the screen time. But the group at the bottom with the open circles, those children were asked, well, how much do you want to play today? Do you want to play less today, more today? So in essence, there was a difference in that the children that had some interaction with their parents about the decision-making of the reduction in screen time, they actually reduced their screen time even further than the group that were just told by their parents, we're going to try to get down to 50% lower than our baseline. So the moral is parenting obviously is quite important, but you also want to engage your children in the appropriate expectations and have them be somewhat responsible for some of the changes that are made. The third reason is that it's much easier to build a healthy habit when you're young than to change a habit once you're an adult. And I think all of us as adults really totally appreciate that for sure. This is a simple little cartoon of a father who's talking to his son. He has a paper in front of him, and he's looking at his paper, and he's thinking, let's see, education, we taught you how to potty train. What's your work experience? You've been able to pick up your toys, doing a few chores, hobbies, thumb sucking. Maybe it is actually too soon to write your resume. So what the message is here is that we do want to develop good habits, but we also don't want to write a child's resume. We just want to enjoy the child, and we want them to have an enjoyable childhood. Pressure is not necessarily good because it can be counterproductive. When you look at some of the behaviors, and this is shocking to me, in 2-month-olds, and this was a group of 863 parents that were surveyed in 4 different healthcare centers. But by 2 months, 12% were already introducing solids, and our recommendation now is to not start solid foods until 6 months. 23% had the bottles propped up, which is problems from the standpoint of tooth health as well as choking issues, as well as, it's not an appropriate thing to do for a child. The 38% were the families really tried to make sure that the bottle was completely finished. So even if the child seemed like they were satisfied and full, there was a lot of encouragement to make sure that all of the formula or breast milk was finished. 50% was watching regular television, 25 minutes a day. And think about this. This is a 2-month-old who really doesn't have very good visual acuity to see a television. They're much more engaged when they see a face to look at, or a face with many expressions. And then 66% didn't need tummy time. So the children are now being placed on their back for sleep, which is appropriate because it can decrease the incidence of SIDS. However, if they're spending so much time on their back and not having free belly time when they're flipped over on their belly, they don't have the opportunity to pull up as easily, because most of the time when children do roll for the first time, it's much easier to roll from their belly to their back than their back to their belly. So what's the next reason? Reason number 4, preferences for food and levels of activity are set by the time children are 2 or 3 years of age. A lot of the research by the dietitians have really talked how important it is to establish a variety of food, very good exposure of different foods, very young, because the preferences tend to be determined pretty early in life. It's not unusual for some children to also have what we call neophobia, meaning there are some foods they just won't eat as a toddler. But that's normal, so you have to work through that, because what you can do is that by repetition, the kids actually are less anxious about it and oftentimes are very accepting once they have that opportunity. So the young children have a chance to really we're forming their habits. So this is a quote, so shape the clay while it's still wet. So what we're saying is that children are most malleable when they're young, and we have to take advantage of that. The 5th reason is that if we don't act early, this will lead to not only high incidence of disease, but also skyrocketing costs in the healthcare system. So while early intervention can lead to decreased health risk, it'll also save money in the long run. There is an estimate that's done by the Ohio Department of Health. They felt that Ohio could avoid estimated obesity-related costs of $19,000 per child if they maintained a healthy weight. And then ultimately that would be a savings of $42 million for the state of Ohio. So clearly that is very important. I have some built-in breaks, so if you want to stop and stretch, you can stop the tape and resume when needed, but I'm going to go on based on this next slide. So what we're going to talk about now is what are the effective health messages. So I just told you why it was so important to establish these early habits, but now we're going to talk about what are the habits that we feel are going to be most helpful in producing a very healthy young child. So over the last 10 or 11 years, when the childhood obesity crisis was becoming very apparent, the researchers have looked at some very clear messaging that we feel is going to prevent any excessive weight early on. One of the greatest messages we can provide is water first for thirst. There's so many children who may be eating or overeating simply because they're thirsty, and water not only provides the fluoride, but also water provides good hydration, which is essential. We really want kids as active as possible. We want to reduce their screen time. We want them involved in free play. The more they're active, we find, the more tired they are, either during nap time or in the evening, and so physical activity can really promote good sleep as well. We want to make sure that the food they're exposed to is very healthy, and we're providing a variety of food. We want mealtime to not be pressured. We want mealtime to be part of exploration, fun, enjoyable, with a positive environment and the atmosphere. We want them to come up with their own play activities, whether it's indoors or outdoors based on the season. Breakfast is an important time to start good eating habits. What we find is that some of the schools will provide really nutritious breakfast during their testing seasons, and obviously there's been some good studies that have supported better cognition and concentration having had breakfast. So we just want that to be an established habit and not be done just during testing time. We want snacks to be healthy snacks and small snacks, but we also want to make sure kids are coming to a meal hungry, so they should not be snacking and grazing all day. So we have to have some structure and definition of our meal times. We want to keep reading to kids. We want to keep helping them communicate. Temper tantrums often occur because there's the lack of the ability to actually communicate what their thoughts or their feelings are. And so by reading to your child, singing to your child, just conversation with your child really promotes the words that the child will end up learning on their own. We love to have great tasters. So basically what we're saying here is that if they're exposed to a lot of different foods, they may not want it, they may not want to swallow it, but we're trying to promote good tasters, so even to put it in their mouth is a great success, and don't pressure them to actually swallow everything, and if they're open to at least try to do it, that's a start, and take small steps. Unquestionably, breastfeeding is a positive thing in so many ways. So it's not just about getting all the immunities from mom and keeping them healthy. It's good, nutritious. But the other thing that's interesting is about breastfeeding is that the mother who is breastfeeding is eating a variety of foods herself. So the exposure that the child gets when they're breastfed is getting the variety of tastes and flavors from mom's diet, which is quite in contrast to formula-fed infants that are just getting the same repetitive taste over and over. So those are some of the key messages, and we're going to go through some of that. The Parenting and Mealtime have incorporated these messages, and we've incorporated them in a very developmental, age-appropriate way. So it's not like you have to make a list and go, oh, yeah, these are the things you need to do. They think about the developmental stage that the child's going through and what's most pertinent at that time. So how do we build this healthy foundation? So the Parenting and Mealtime has really broad messages in addition to those messages we just talked about. And if you think about it in broad terms, it makes sense in that it all contributes to developing healthy habits. So we can't underestimate the importance of play, and I consider this to be free play and child-led play. So when I say child-led, it means those are the ones that are exploring a new activity. They may make up their own rules, or they may do a lot of imitative play where they want to be like mommy and daddy, or they want to be like our daycare worker. And so they really they become very creative when they do it on their own. The second broad message is, what is the eating environment in which they're being raised in? If it's positive, it's nurturing, it's fun, they're going to be much more accepting of foods, and they won't be as picky, hopefully, in that it's a positive environment as opposed to a real stressful environment where it's either super rushed or there's a very significant demand for them to eat something specifically, and it's presented in a really authoritarian style, like you have to do this or else you will be punished, or you won't get that unless you do this. So we want it to be more of a pleasurable environment, and it matters who's at the table with you. If you're eating with your child, that can be very positive for the child because they'll be imitating or observing how you eat, which also really helps influence the child's behavior. And then, of course, sleep and structure. So we mentioned structure may be in the meal time, snack time, and nap time, but it also is incorporated in the routine. So when we think about how kids thrive and do well, oftentimes they don't necessarily have to have a total exact science in their structure, but we want them to have at least some pretty clear expectations of structure and guidelines, and we want them to have a good preparation for sleep that really calms them down, and we want to promote as much good sleep as possible. So we've talked a lot about food and play and sleep, but really these effective strategies are all nurturing this child, because when children are first born, they have less connections in their brain. So this is a picture about the nerve endings and the nerve connections in the brain. So the picture on the left is the newborn, and obviously there's less connections in that. And as the child grows and gets stimulated, it strengthens all those connections. And in fact, you build more connections. So the brain actually doubles in size in just 1 year, and by year 3, it's almost the size of an adult. What's also important to see in these pictures when you move from 9 months to 2 years to the adult is that you can almost appreciate that the difference between the 2-year and the adult is that the 2-year has a lot of connections, but some of them are very, very thin connections, and as you move to adulthood, you see very solid, darker connections. So what also happens over time is the neurons tend to be pruned, just like pruning a fruit tree in the springtime. So the connections that are not strengthened and not used over time can actually disappear. So we want to keep stimulating these children so they have great connections and they have strong bonded connections. So stimulated nerves get stronger, and we have to think about that in terms of learning and memory and using all 5 senses to develop those nerves. Play is a perfect example in which this can occur. If you think about play, it's not just physically active, but they're learning how to engage with another child perhaps. They're also learning negotiation skills, things like, oh, no, that's mine, or so they learn to share. They're also learning a lot about creativity. Oftentimes they make up their own games, they make up their own fun, and they're really learning to communicate. So it could be between a peer, it could be between a child and an adult. We have found that kids are incredibly resilient when they're given a chance to actually play, and they learn cooperation, which is obviously a very important lesson in life. At the same time when they're playing, they're learning their fundamental motor skills. So we talk about more of the gross motor skills, which are the bigger things that first they learn to stand, then they learn to walk, then they can start to run and hop and skip. So they still develop each thing takes more balance, more strength as they get older, and at the same time they're learning what we call object control, which is the fine motor skills. So it's the throwing and the catching and the stacking, the puzzle solving, the drawing, the finger painting. And it also has to do with the self-feeding. So you move from finger feeding to actually using utensils. And all of these are important. But these are all learned skills. And there's a doctor at The Ohio State University, Dr. Goodway, who really has done a lot of work looking at the motor skill development. And basically her assessment is that the components of play can actually lead to long-term success when it comes to physical skills. So you can never expect a child who really hasn't played and moved to really be an athlete in high school because they've missed some of those milestones, and that these are learned. You don't need fancy tools to do this. Really, I think it's a matter of just making sure that they have that opportunity. Screen time. We now live in a society where electronics have basically taken over most of the free time that the kids have, and unfortunately a lot of it is passive use of screen time. We do have, an increased urbanization, and so people are always worried about safety. They're always worried about, whether there's space or a park nearby. And so I think that the screen time, whether it's television, videos, computer, cell phones, Netflix, the truth is, if they're indoors and they're on their screens but they're safe, obviously parents feel comfortable with that. But I think we have to understand that it's also so critical for them to have an opportunity to be able to say, let's have some media-free time. Let's have some family time. Let's have some play time. So screens can make good babysitters, but not all the time. I did have one home visitor tell me that she's been in a family several times, and their toddler is typically strapped into a car seat on the floor in one of their rooms with the television on. And so while the mom is doing some other chores around the house, she's sure that her child is safe because they're in a car seat with the seatbelt on watching television. But what we talked about is I understand that that's good in that the child is safe, but also that child is totally restrained. So we have to really teach them that maybe they can sit quietly and watch the television instead of actually be buckled into a seat, because we want that child to also have an opportunity to get up and stretch and possibly help mom with chores. That's another concept. So play, we said, is important, but don't underestimate that a mealtime can be play. And when the children are using their five senses or using their motor skills, they really are exploring. And as they explore, they get more and more confident and they get more and more engaged. So there's a term called sensory education and exploration. And basically when we see that kids are engaging with their senses, we may see that a picky eater who is not in a stressful environment may be more open to try something new because it's presented differently. This is just kind of fun. This is the color. What do you think of? How does this feel in your hand? You don't necessarily have to have them eat it. It's really a matter of exploration, but keeping it stress-free. We find that if you try to stress your child out and make them do certain things, it tends to be counterproductive, and you're going to get less of success than you would otherwise. So use those senses: taste, smell, feel, sound. Even Rice Krispies used to have a little advertisement about the snap, crackle, pop, which is kind of funny, but it gives you a good example of how you can use even sound. Repetition is key. So you have to understand that the first time, if it's not, we're wired for sugar and salt. So if the food is not salty and the food is not sweet, it may not be accepted initially. It doesn't mean that with repetition, it will continue to not be accepted. So we have found repetition really does make a difference. And the repetition itself can really increase the acceptance of food. If you have a child who's really reluctant to taste something, pair it with different familiar tastes. There's a lot of ketchup users, there's ranch dressing users, barbecue sauce. We don't really worry about all those extra calories if you can really diversify the child's plate. Plus, if they're eating that in moderation, that's certainly helpful as well. Don't forget that neophobia, which means that they may have certain foods that they just won't try, that's actually normal in this age group. And so if there's some positive association with trying something new as opposed to pressure, and you can pair it with a familiar food, they may be much more likely to be accepting of that. Focus on the fun, the tasting, the exploring. So instead of asking children if they like what they're eating, maybe ask them to taste the food and tell you what they think. So don't guide them. Let them give you a sense. They may say things, oh, it's mushy, or it feels hot in my mouth, or it feels cold, or they talk more about texture sometimes than they talk about the taste. And that may release or minimize some of the anxiety associated with trying something new. The next broad topic is really about sort of the eating environment. So the researchers have showed us that there's different ways in which a child really learns how to eat. So this was a review article. Birch and Dow are both dietitians. And this was published in 2014, and it really kind of reemphasized how kids learn and what we can do to help them develop those good eating habits early in life. They emphasize the importance of the parent-child feeding relationship. So again, this has to do with what kind of environment is it being presented to it. If it's fun, if it's playtime, during mealtime, the child may be much more accepting. And if the parent is eating a certain vegetable or a certain fruit, the child may be very interested in eating what the parent is eating, so they learn by observation. So the parents' feeding practices really are the key to the food preferences and the eating behaviors. So ultimately, the parents or the adults in charge are the ones that are determining what the child is going to eat, where they're going to eat, and when they're going to eat. Now, from a standpoint of the child, we really want the child to learn self-regulation in that the child is the one who decides how much they're going to eat. Traditionally, there were different practices that really interfered with this self-regulation. For instance, just feeding someone to soothe them if they're crying, or pressuring a child to eat something that they really don't want to eat. That can backfire. Or if you're feeding them frequently and they're getting a lot of snack foods, they're going to be a lot less likely to accept what you serve for dinner. And then sometimes parents are so frustrated that they only serve the kid-friendly foods. So you've got a kid who's stuck on mac and cheese and that's all. Well, what's happened by that is you've accepted that selective eating style instead of trying to broaden their acceptance. So these traditional feeding practices really are more directed by the adult, and what we hope is that the adult provides the opportunity and the child accepts that opportunity and self-regulates. So keep in mind that most of these practices really compromise that development of self-regulation, which we're trying to promote in children. Children learn by really the most familiar exposure. So if you think about this, familiarization, it's not only modeling, but it really is also what they're exposed to. So when you think about things that are familiar, when a child is formula fed, they are getting one taste and one taste only, and obviously that's quite familiar. In contrast to a child that is breastfed, they're getting a variety of flavors based on the maternal diet. So once mom eats a variety of foods, actually the breast milk will change with a variety of flavors as well. So we consider that to even be a good opportunity to start some variety of flavors early in life. Early exposure and repetition obviously seems to be key because when they are familiar, they do better. And then the next point, which I brought up already, is that neophobia to novel foods and flavors can increase until middle childhood. So it can be very normal, but it's better, I'm not saying ignore it, but I think it's better to acknowledge that that's the way it is, but don't give up. Don't get frustrated and just keep trying, because sometimes when you pair that food with something they're really familiar with and comfortable with, they do quite well. So don't forget that it's repetition that's important and familiarization that's quite important. The other way they learn is by association, and that has to do more with the environment in which the food is introduced or the meal is or the snack is prepared. So if you're a positive person, it's engaging, it's in fun, they may be much more willing to try a food. If you're pairing a new food with a familiar food and you just do it, you don't necessarily have to talk about it, maybe that would be the easiest thing and the simplest way to strategize it. And also, we want to promote good tasters. So that's somebody who's open and willing. So associative learning really just means that is that exposure to something new a positive thing? Do they feel good about trying as opposed to being coerced into doing something that they're uncomfortably doing? And the third is observational learning, which makes perfect sense. So kids learn by imitating. They learn all kinds of things. They learn language, they learn behaviors, they learn facial expressions. I mean, there isn't a parent on this planet that hasn't felt like their child was parroting what they've heard from their parent. But it's important because they observe what the adult eats, they observe what another sibling might be eating, and they really follow. So the adults in the children's lives are excellent role models, and we hope very much that the parent is emulating the good habits that we want the child to acquire. So remember that the parenting tips make sense. So there is a division of responsibility that actually starts as early as infancy. I mean, but as kids get a little older, toddler years, preschool years, parents still are the ones deciding what to eat, where to eat, and when. And the children are the ones that really are deciding how much that they'd like to eat. But we really want to emphasize is there's cues. There's cues. Parents know their children better than anybody. And so if the parents learn the cues about when they're really hungry versus are they just crying because they're mad or they're tired, are they crying because they need their diaper change? I mean, all crying doesn't mean they're hungry. And so the parents are the best people. They know their children the best to make that decision of whether they really need to eat or not. So the last broad topic has to do with structure and sleep. And we have found that kids, and I go back to that one study that had the children in daycare, and I'm not promoting daycare, I'm just saying that there was clear structure in that daycare setting, and so the expectations were set very early in life. So the benefit of sleep we cannot underestimate. We've had a requirement, a new recommendation based on hopefully the prevention of SIDS, which is the sudden infant death syndrome. And the ABCs of sleep include sleeping alone, sleeping on your back, and sleeping in a crib that is bare, basically just the mattress itself. So that's the safest place in the room for the baby to sleep. And then we want parents to recognize that even a sleep schedule is important to establish as early as possible. There's been some studies showing that, believe it or not, as early as kindergarten, about a third of these kids having some sleeping issues where they don't concentrate as well, they're moody, they're not very happy. So we're seeing a lot more of sleep difficulties than we've ever seen before. When it comes to sleep, the last thing I do want to say is that the more active you are during the day, the more tired you'll be at night, and then you may have a very restful sleep when you're given the opportunity. So schedules and routines are the backbone structure for a healthy habit for the whole family. So we're not saying it has to be exactly disciplined. It's really a matter of setting the expectations and setting the structure and doing your best to maintain that structure. So it has to do with meals, snacks, when is it appropriate to have the free play time, and make sure your child is getting enough sleep. I usually give the example of recharging an electronic like a cell phone. I mean, the truth is sleep for us that's how we recharge, right? You can't go very many days without sleep. And then food is also our source of energy. So I want families to understand that kids are growing, kids do have reasonable appetites, but we also want to keep it structured because toddlers tend to eat a little, stop, eat a little, and even some toddlers will go all day and they're not hungry. They're not starving. I assure you that if they have had a longer stretch of time without food, then we'll find that as the next day they may actually eat a little bit extra. So just be patient and hang in there. So we talked about messaging, more detailed messaging. We've talked about broader messaging. And now we're going to talk about how do we really inspire these adults to really adopt these strategies. You now have 5 reasons as to why this is so critically important. And we want to constantly let the families know that these habits get established early. And we've seen from research recently that food preferences, activity styles versus active ones versus sedentary styles, they just are formed so early in childhood, and they typically closely mirror that of their parents. So we want parents to understand how influential they are so early in life. The second point being that prevention is possible. And whatever we can do at the onset of their life will hopefully last all the way through adulthood. And we have seen improved sustainable change. Like, for instance, if I see kids that are water drinkers early on in life, there's a good likelihood that they're going to continue to be water drinkers, as opposed to the excessive juice drinkers early in childhood tend to be the excessive soda drinkers as they get older. Third is they're small children. Sometimes a small change can really lead to a big improvement and a big outcome. So it's a whole lot easier to make a small change when they're young. I see patients in the Center for Healthy Weight that are very, very overweight, and now you're talking about trying to change habits and try to lose weight. And there's no question that weight management gets really difficult for the older kids for sure. So oftentimes I wish that I had seen some of these kids when they were 5, 6, 7 and really had worked on making changes at that point, because I think the outcome would be much better than what I'm dealing with at the forefront. The fourth is parents or any adults in their life are the best teachers. Kids mimic what they see, they observe behavior, they learn from the people around them. And I think this is important for them to know, regardless of who it is, the guardian, the grandparent, the teacher, the preschool teacher, the daycare person. The bottom line is we have to be good role models for these kids, because that's really what they see the most. So the child is learning by what's practiced every day and what's most familiar to them. So we cannot underestimate that. When we talk to families, we don't talk specifically about weight. We really talk about establishing good habits. So you've seen already that the influence of the feeding practices is so much dependent on the interaction between the parent and the child. So if we let the kids explore the food, enjoy the food, but we give them that atmosphere, which is positive, then if it's child-led, they will be very much more receptive and open. Same with activity. I think if you've ever played with a toddler, you'll see. If you see the world through the toddler's eyes and you think about their child-led play, it provides creativity, it provides self-confidence, it provides the ability to cooperate and negotiate. But there's nothing more rewarding than doing something with your child and seeing how they're engaged and how they're progressing with self-esteem over time. We feel schedules are really important. We want regular feeding, activity schedules, definitely some sleep structure. I see a lot of kids that have significant sleeping issues, and I think the parents are very, very passive in their expectations for the sleep. And I think if they just started them early on with a really good sleep regimen, they would be much better off. Same with meals and snacks. You don't necessarily have to have a meal at a specific time, but maybe you have windows of meals. So the meal time, and the kid knows, and then in between those meals, maybe the kitchen's closed, just like a restaurant might close, and you can say the kitchen will be open again at such and such a time, and that's when we're going to have our next meal. So they're not anxious about when they're going to get fed again. It's very clear expectations. We really want to support the parent and child engagement. So all of these activities, whether it's activities through reading to playing with them, feeding, eating with them, all of this supports that nurturing environment in which we know is going to really help those children thrive. So take the long view on these behavioral changes. We just clearly have seen that the sustainable approach, once it builds that healthy foundation, we're hoping that that's a foundation that stays persistent through life. Also, when it comes to nutrition, of course there are really specific guidelines. The federal government is coming up with some very specific guidelines from birth to 2. It has not been published yet. Typically the guidelines for Americans, the dietary guidelines for Americans, start at age 2, so this is a big change to go down to birth to 2. It's not published yet, but every 5 years there's a new publication called the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And again, it's all about the nutrients, meaning it's nutrient quality. So it's nutrient dense, which means we want them to make sure that they're eating the right type of foods, the age proportion of foods, and getting that variety of foods. We want to promote responsive feeding strategies, so we want parents to understand the cues that the children have even as early as infancy, when they're really hungry and when they're actually just looking for attention perhaps, or maybe they're thirsty, and so giving them water is a better option than feeding them constantly. Remember that meals really include a lot of the sensory education. When we talked about using the 5 senses, make it an opportunity for fun and exploration. And children are building skills over time. So even the primitive skills they learn in the beginning of life, they keep building on top of those skills. So they rely on their parents or their adult caregivers to actually teach them those skills. That's not necessarily intuitive on their own. We want children to be active. You don't have to use the term exercise. Think in terms of movement and play. Kids develop strong balance and motor skills, meaning muscle strength. They start to learn to be better coordinated, and you'll see that as they go through their developmental milestones. This does happen in the home. They don't need to go to any formal classwork. With free play, it's amazing how well they can develop their motor skills. We want you to be a good role model with activity. Take the stairs whenever you have an opportunity. Walk with your children to the bus stop if possible. And make sure that if there's a dog to walk, maybe somebody walks the dog. I mean, I think if they see that there's an active person they're living with, they're going to be more engaged with the activity and perhaps less engaged with the sedentary television, computer, cell phone, etc. Don't forget using the 5 senses in any activity you're doing, particularly in play. And really, active living is a learned skill. I mean, that sounds kind of, in some ways, intuitive, but I believe that one of the biggest influences in the children is watching their adult partners. And if the adults are living an active and healthy lifestyle, the kids will follow suit. The last message we would like to share with you before moving on to the actual components of the Parenting and Mealtime program is just the concept of motivational interviewing. It's also referred to as MI. Traditional practices when you're treating someone, for instance, in a healthcare setting, is they have a problem, maybe an ear infection, you give them an antibiotic, and you prescribe that antibiotic, you solve the problem, they go home, and things are hopefully all good again. That's really a prescriptive style, meaning somebody is making a decision, they're treating something, and it's not driven by the family, it's driven by the medical condition or by the healthcare provider. Motivational interviewing, which is now being incorporated in medical management, is quite different. It's considered to be patient or family oriented and driven. So what that means, for instance, is if you're talking with a family and let's say you see a family that either is drinking excessive juice or you see a family that has the television on all the time or they're eating in different places or you see sort of a chaotic environment, if you start to ask some open-ended questions about what you're observing, you may get some very good information back. So I like to start any kind of motivational interviewing with what I consider an affirmation, a really important, powerful, and empowering statement like, you know, I see how much you care about your child. You know, I see that you're providing a really safe environment here. And so you're giving them immediately some, you're empowering them, but B, I think you're giving them a sense that you're not judgmental, because I know that's always a concern when you see something that you're not real comfortable with, but nobody's really sure how to address it. But I think what's also important is you can say, well, how do you feel about this? Susie's kind of running close to the oven. What are your thoughts? And maybe they'll tell you what their thoughts are, and so then you understand where they're coming from. It's always best to show them that you're listening to them. So maybe they'll say that, I let Susie get her own water because I figure getting water is probably getting better than getting a snack. So that's why Susie's in the kitchen even though the oven's on. So she has a very reasonable explanation as to why Susie's in the kitchen. But I think you can even go further, because if you're worried about a safety concern with the oven being on, for instance, I'm just using that as an example, you get more information. So you can say, again, I think it's so great that you're so careful about her safety issues. And then you just keep working with them. So you have to have a lot of patience. You have to realize that changing somebody's behavior can take a long time. But it's okay to have some goal settings. And we want the goal setting to be defined by the parent or the family. The goal should not be defined by you. It should be what they feel that they're able and willing to do. And remember that success comes in small changes. So you might have a teeny little change, but you can build on that change over time. And some families aren't ready for change, so you have to stick with it, be patient, and readdress it when another situation arises. But there's a lot of powerful behavioral change that occur when you do use motivational interviewing. So just think about asking open-ended questions. That's probably the most important message. Don't ask questions that are going to get you a yes or no answer. Ask a question like, what are your thoughts about this? Or how would you see that this could be different? Just keep coming up with questions that they have to answer and give you a little bit more substantial information back. So we've been through a lot of different aspects. We've gone through basically this is why it's important, and then we talked about the broad messages about nutrition and the environment as well as structure and the sleep. And then we even talked about sort of the more key messages, the more detailed messages. So what we have done with the Parenting and Mealtime and Playtime, PMP program, is we've really looked at developmental milestones, changes over time. Your families are going to be most engaged when they see their child roll over for the first time or pull to a stand for the first time or start to finger feed or change from formula or breast milk to solid. So what we've done is we've focused our parenting handouts, our phone app, which we'll go through now. All of our information has been really geared towards the developmental milestone and the appropriate age change for that child, as well as engagement. So we're not just saying you need to feed them this. We're saying, have you noticed they're doing this? And we'll move to the next category. So all of your resources are going to be available online, and anyone who has signed up for this webinar is also, there's going to be a place where Renee is going to give you the opportunity to ask for a spiral notebook, which will have all of the handouts. She's going to go over that a little bit more in a second. But I want to show you an example of one of our handouts from the newborn to 4 months. So we've clustered some age groups, but you're going to see on this handout there's a section for parenting tips, section for feeding advice, a section for activity advice, and sleep advice. So that's on the front page. If you flip it over on the back page, you're going to see action steps. So it's more engaging in that, what have you noticed your child? What are the things you can do right now? What's play with a purpose? Can you try this? What's going to come next? So we feel like they're really engaged in what their particular child's doing. So we're giving prescriptive information, but we're also giving an opportunity for them to have some action steps in which they can incorporate all of these messages. So all of the things we've talked about in this webinar are rolled into these handouts, and they're all age specific. So all you have to do is really address the family based on the age of their particular child. We also have developed a mobile app which is free. It can be used by you all. It also the information can be shared by to your families. What's so nice about this is it has all of our handouts embedded in the app. It's designed so it's also very age specific. We have categories. If you go into the first page of this, you'll see, for instance, 4 to 6 months. You click on 4 to 6 months. Then you see another drop down. It has parent tips. It has nutrition advice, physical activity advice. You'll see our handout there. We've even embedded some video clips as you scroll down per age group. And the families can put in, they have to set up a password first, but they can put in their child's date of birth based on the age without having any personal information of the parent's name or the child's name. And then that child, let's say they were born today, then this family will get text reminders and notifications about the milestones that are going to be appropriate for the child's age, and reminders also to get their well visits on a really nice schedule to keep them in good health. This is the direct link to get to the mobile app instructions. And as I said before, you can create an account by completing the information at the top of the page. And like I said, it's going to ask for the child's date of birth, and you need to put in email information and set up a password. But this has been very helpful because this is an extension of what you may find in not only the healthcare provider setting, but we've been trying to share this with as many people as possible in Ohio, not just the healthcare providers. The WIC dietitians may have this information, the daycare centers may have this information. So what we're trying to do is give some unified messaging within the state of Ohio. So we all have a role to play. I know you as a home visitor is really at the ground level. You are soldiers in the field, so I absolutely appreciate all the work that you do. I believe the healthcare providers in the state of Ohio are doing their share. We have healthcare providers, child care providers, preschool providers that are engaged in this as well. So we're hoping that the messages will be quite unified throughout the state. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Renee, who's going to talk a little bit more about the implementation.
Hi there. So as Dr. Sternstein mentioned, we are working on a unified approach to the messaging across Ohio, and so you are part of a cohort of home visitors that have heard similar presentation and this message through in-person trainings. And so one of the ways that we want to be able to track and provide technical assistance is to have some input and tracking from you. So the Ohio Department of Health team is really leading this process, and so you have received a document that is that looks like this, and this is the PNP visit record. And so at various points through the process in giving out these handouts or in utilizing the handouts in discussions with families, we would love your feedback on those, particularly which handouts you reviewed, which handouts were given, that kind of thing. And the document is a submittable format, so it's an Adobe PDF format. You'll go in and fill it out. You can click the submit button on the form, and that will send it directly to our colleagues at the Ohio Department of Health. Should you have problems, or if for whatever reason that format isn't working for you, you are welcome to scan it, to fill it out by hand and scan it, and send that to Emily Torres, whose information is at the end of this PowerPoint. And so as we move forward, there will be a 3-month and a 6-month follow-up survey that will be shared by our colleagues at the Ohio Department of Health. We will have various resources coming out over the next couple of weeks in which we will be sharing with you to incorporate into your work with families. So that includes the new handouts that are coming out. We've got a picky eating handout and a stress-free mealtime handout that are currently up on our website on the dashboard. And we will have 2 new handouts coming in the next few weeks in which we will share with you via email. There will also be additional resources and things that come out over the next few weeks and months that we'll be sharing with you as well. You are absolutely welcome to send us questions. So in receiving this email, with the link to the website, you likely have my email. It's Renee Dickman at rdickman@ohioaap.org. And the contact for Emily Torres is on the screen here. She is your contact for that, the PNP record, the handouts record. So anytime you submit that, she will be your contact for that. She and I work very closely together, so should you have questions about the program itself, the handouts, the app, anything, if you get a hold of either one of us, we'll be able to help you. And so as far as moving forward with the process for receiving your credit for this training, you have received a post-training evaluation survey. That survey is through SurveyMonkey. And as Dr. Sternstein mentioned, there is a box, a question on that survey in which you can select yes or no to receive a hard copy, like a paper copy of the handouts. And you are more than welcome to receive one of those. We would love to share the content if that is your preferred method of reading and learning. And so we will happily mail that to you. And so if that is something you would like, you will have the option to select that on the survey. If you don't and you are happy using the electronic version, by all means, please do. You will just select no for that question. With that, I would like to thank Dr. Sternstein for her time and for her continuous leadership of the Parenting at Mealtime Playtime program, as well as our Ohio Department of Health